Hello, this is Mike from Urban Legends and Mythology, and welcome to the 50th episode of this series. Yes, that's right, 50 episodes. Now, to be honest, that's kind of a milestone in podcasting because statistically, most podcasts never make it to 50 episodes. And the fact that this one has made it this far is a testament to the fact that there are simply people listening to it who enjoy the content, who want to hear more, who tune in week after week, as well as a testament to my overall stubbornness in the fact that I was simply not going to give up on this project. Despite everybody who didn't believe in it, who doesn't like hearing about the fact that I have a podcast because I never shut up about it, despite all of that, I've hit 50 episodes, I've proved them wrong, it's a successful show, and I hope to be doing it for a very long time. And that is all thanks to you listeners. You guys are the reason why I do this. It drives me to create more content, and to be honest, it's an addiction at this point. I'm never gonna stop. And with that out of the way, I do want to do a special topic for the 50th episode. Now, this is a topic that has been requested since day one. I've always said I was going to do it, but it's always been on the back burner just because I didn't really know how to approach it. But I finally think I'm confident enough in the source material to approach it. So this is the legend, the myth, the true history of King Arthur. So I'm sure we're all familiar with Geoffrey of Monmouth's tale of King Arthur. His father was Uther Pendragon. He was conceived at Tittengale. He hung out with this wizard named Merlin. He grows up alongside Lancelot, who is basically his brother from another mother. He goes on to defeat the Saxons in various battles, and he establishes his court at Camelot, where he constructs this round table where everybody is an equal, and he has his famous Knights of the Round Table, and they go on all these adventures, and they quest for the Holy Grail, and all that fun stuff. And Camelot becomes this almost Eden-like paradise for this king. However, they are kicked from paradise just like in the story of Eden because they succumb to sins of the flesh and jealousies and rivalries, and then his own son usurps the throne, and it leads to their final battle where they kill each other, and then he's taken to Avalon, where he will one day rise again at England's darkest hour in order to save the kingdom. And it spins off into countless stories of these quests and these mythical creatures and this magic and all this cool stuff. But we have to ask the ultimate question: is this myth, is this legend of Arthur actually based on an actual king and an actual place? And the answer to that question is extremely muddy. Some people say yes, some people say no, some people are constantly weaving back and forth in between. But being on this show where we analyze the real history of this stuff, let's dive right into it. And where do we start? Where we always do, right at the beginning. And this time the beginning is actually sub-Roman Britain in the 400s to 500s AD. Now, what makes this era extremely difficult and extremely fascinating is the fact that we simply don't have any real written accounts to turn to give us some context of the day and age. At this time, Rome was leaving Britain to its own devices, and most of the people left behind were illiterate. And the earliest written accounts of what we would see as this man Arthur don't even show up in, well, traditions until about 300 or 400 years after the fact. So we kind of have to piece this story together from local legend, archaeology, history, and what we know of the time and what we can speculate of the time. But what we do know for sure is that Arthur, if he existed, or if the inspiration for him existed, he would have existed during this time, probably in the late 400s or early 500s, when the Romans were abandoning Britannia and dealing with all their little civil wars and conflicts that basically leads to the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, basically, this kicks off in 407 when Constantine III of Rome, he recalls his forces from Britannia into Gaul. And while this had been done before in Britannia, this was the last time it would ever be done because the Romans, they wouldn't be returning to Britannia at this time. Because you see, in the past, what would happen would be governors of Britannia, they would leave Rome because they would have at least 3 legions who were loyal to them on their side, and they would leave Rome and cross over into Gaul and usually fight in a civil war in order to take the imperial throne. And usually in the past, what would happen is this little power vacuum would take place, the economy would collapse locally, and the native population would usually rebel because, hey, the Roman authorities aren't there to instill their will and power on the people. But generally, after all the chaos had settled down, the legions would come back, the Roman authority would come back, and, Britain, it was a Roman province for 400 years. However, after this time, by about 410, it seems like the Western Roman Empire had basically given up on Britannia, because with all this constant conflict on the continent, they just couldn't provide resources and men to Britannia anymore. And then after around 410, they were basically told to look to their own defenses. Now, at this time, a lot of people think that Rome just left Britain and abandoned it, and there was nobody there but the natives, and then the Angles and Saxons moved in. Well, that's not entirely true, because there were still people in Britain at the time for at least a couple of generations who were still calling themselves Roman and still living in that Roman lifestyle and that Roman way. Because we have to remember that, like America, Rome is more than just a territorial boundary. It is an idea. The idea of being a Roman citizen is the same as the idea of being an American. It's a cultural thing. It's ingrained in us no matter what your background is. It's an attitude and a lifestyle and a culture, and that still went on after the legions were pulled from Rome. Now, that's not to say there weren't a lot of prominent citizens that went with them because they figured this is it. However, the auxiliaries were still there. They were still there defending the walls of the cities in Hadrian's Wall. A lot of the people who were essentially running the cities and the marketplaces, they were still there. And the people outside the cities in the Roman villas, they were still there, and they were still living the same lifestyle and calling themselves Roman. However, when it was made clear when Rome was not returning and the legions weren't returning, a lot of people had to focus on their own self-rule at this time. And this greatly benefited the native Britons, who made up a majority of the population and were basically seen as second-class citizens. Hell, they weren't even actually seen as citizens, because at the time, if you were a native Briton, the only way you can really gain citizenship in Rome is to be part of the auxiliary, and after 20 years of service to Rome, you would be granted citizenship. But with that no longer being the system, and a lot of these auxiliary units being left behind, they started focusing on their own local issues instead, and a lot of them established themselves as armies surrounding their tribal leader or their tribal king at the time. And the native Britons, mostly being farmers and agriculturalists, having no use for the Roman cities, basically abandoned them. And without a huge influx of trade anymore, the cities started to dwindle as people left and went to go seek other opportunities, mostly on the continent. And it seems that the last people in Britain to still call themselves Roman, they still lived on. Some of them lived on. It's argued up until like the middle of the 6th century, who were still calling themselves Roman. But they had largely abandoned the Roman way by, I would argue, the middle of the 5th century, about the 450s, about the time we see Arthur come around. And this is a period of time that's always really fascinated me, because I always wondered at what point did the subsequent generations stop calling themselves Roman and start aligning themselves with the kingdoms that would rise out of this dissolution of Roman authority in Britain. And in order to give my honest opinion, I think that answer is about 2 or 3 generations, either your grandson's generation or your great-grandson's generation. Because I can imagine some Roman citizen living in, let's say, London or Londinium at the time, at about the time of 410 when Roman authority kind of breaks down. And I can imagine the guy saying, well, this is my home, I'm not leaving, I'm gonna stay here until I die. And maybe his son grows up in this city and he's still calling himself a Roman. However, the city is gradually being abandoned and shrinking as people disperse for other opportunities, or they disperse into the local populations. And maybe at this point, this guy, he leaves Londinium for the countryside because there's just no opportunities in this dying, desolate old town. And we'll say he moves into the countryside and he becomes affiliated with one of these subsequent kingdoms which rise up. And then I can argue that his son wouldn't call himself a Roman. He would see himself as affiliated under this new kingdom that had popped up. Or maybe he affiliates himself with the Saxons, who come in and basically take over parts of England. And I think it's sometime around this generation during this muddied history when these people are no longer considering themselves Roman and considering themselves part of these new, what would become the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, is when Arthur first shows up. So now we ask ourselves, who is Arthur? And to be honest, for this part, I am going to bounce back and forth between some historical stuff and the legend. So you're going to have to take what I say with a grain of salt. Now, me personally, I do believe that there was probably a sub-Roman Britain whose name was Arthur, or something like Arthur, who actually existed, who was a warlord during this time. Whether or not he was a king, I have no idea, but I can tell you that during this time, when the Saxons were making their little incursions into Britain, there were prominent native and sub-Roman warlords who were fighting to keep them out, and Arthur, he was one of the successful ones. At least he was successful in a few battles. And to be honest, anybody who is native born to their land and loyal to their people who has successfully driven out an invader is going to end up in legend. And if the legend endures, for example, 1500 years, somebody who's 1500 years removed from that is gonna have a lot of legend and historical fact intertwined when telling this person's life story. And some people think that this man could have been a warlord named Artorius, who we know very little about. However, we do know that name is derived from a Roman family who had members in the Senate at various times. And some people think that the legend of Arthur is just a retelling of the life of Ambrosius Aurelianus, who was the leader of a local warband in sub-Roman Britain, who won important battles against the Saxons and was propped up as a legendary figure in the local lore. It's believed that he was probably from high birth or local noble birth, and he was possibly a Christian, and it's said that his parents were killed by Saxon invaders, and in response to this raid which killed his parents, he organizes a group of local survivors into an army, and he gives the Saxons hell. And he becomes one of these figures known as the last of the Romans, at least in Britain. And that, with the time period of sub-Roman Britain, kind of alludes to this connection with the Roman Empire that was still there, which was kind of common during this time and in subsequent years all around the areas around Europe. All these monarchs, they wanted this ancient connection with Rome. In their minds, having those ancient connections with these Roman authority, these Roman royals, that kind of like legitimized them in their own eyes. And hell, we saw that all the way up until the fall of the Byzantine Empire, you know, in the 1400s. For example, the Tsar of Russia, well, he wasn't the Tsar at the time, but he marries the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, and with that connection, he declares Russia to be the third Rome. And stuff like that even carries through to some of the modern monarchs of today. They want this connection to this glorious past to help legitimize their rule. But I'm off on a tangent now, so let's get back to Arthur. So Ambrosius Aurelianus, a lot of people believe that that's where the Arthur name came from, or it might have come from this Roman family Artorius. But we can't start with a discussion of Arthur without first looking at the story of his father and mother, a man named Uther Pendragon and a woman named Lady Igraine. So Uther Pendragon, who was a king of sub-Roman Britain, who was believed in the legend to be the son of Constantine III and a younger brother to Aurelius Ambrosius, where we believe that the King Arthur myth is based on, but in Howard of Monmouth's tale it gets twisted and Ambrosius becomes his uncle. We'll get into that later. He is the legendary father of Arthur. Now, a few references to King Uther appear in Old Welsh poems, but his biography was first written down in the 12th century by Geoffrey of Monmouth in his Historia Regum Britannia. Now, he is a fairly ambiguous individual, but he is described as a strong king and a defender of his people, which I guess is a good thing if you're king. So, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth, which his stories have to be taken with a grain of salt because he was just known to have just made stuff up. So Uther is the youngest son of Constantine III. Now his eldest brother, a man named Constans, succeeds to the throne of their little kingdom upon his father's death, but he's murdered at the instigation of his advisor, a man called Vortigern, who seizes the throne. So Uther and his other brother, Aurelius Ambrosius, still children at this time, end up fleeing to Brittany, which, if you don't know, it's that little peninsula on the edge of France that kind of has its own cultural identity. So while Vortigern is king, he makes an alliance alliance with the Saxons under a man named Heingeist, but it goes disastrously wrong. Later, years later, Aurelius and Uther now return as adults, and they burn Vortigern in his castle, and Aurelius becomes king. And to be honest, this story is already starting to sound like a plotline from Game of Thrones, but I digress. I wonder what J.R.R. Martin's doing right now. Obviously not writing. So with Aurelius now on the throne, with him being the older brother, Uther, he actually goes to Ireland to help Merlin bring the stones of Stonehenge from there to Britain, because apparently I guess the ancient monolith of Stonehenge just happened to not be in Britain at the time for some reason. I don't know. Monmouth was weird. Now later, while Aurelius takes ill, Vortigern's son, he was a man named Pascent. He, along with some Saxon allies, they seize the opportunity to attack, and Uther, he raises an army in order to fight off this invasion. Now on his way to the battle, he sees a comet in the shape of a dragon in the sky, which Merlin interprets as presaging Aurelius's death and Uther's glorious future, which is kind of a mixed omen, but okay. So Uther goes on to win the battle, and after this he takes the epithet Pendragon, which means head of the dragon, or basically the king, whatever. However, upon returning from the battle, he finds Aurelius dead, because apparently the illness was actually a result of poisoning. But despite this, he becomes king, and with his new epithet Pendragon, he orders the construction of 2 gold dragons, one of which he uses as his standard. So he later goes on to secure Britain's frontiers, and he quells Saxon uprisings with the aids of his retainers, one of these being a man named Gorlias, who is apparently the Duke of Cornwall at the time. And at a banquet celebrating their victories, Uther becomes obsessively enamored with Gorlias's wife, Iggerna. I hate these early Romano-British names. They're hard to say. So with Uther obviously being like obsessively enamored by Iggernia, I'm just gonna call her Iggernia because I do not know how to pronounce this name, this actually leads to a war ensuing between Uther and his vassal Gorlias. So Gorlias sends Iggernia to the castle of Tittengale for protection, while he himself is besieged by Uther in another town. So basically at this point, Uther is like horn dogging hard over this guy's wife, and he's willing to like literally go to war just so he can bet her. So Uther consults with Merlin, who we all know Merlin, he's like his trusted wizard. And a real quick historical side note, Merlin, he's most likely a mystic or a druid. Now while it's believed that at this time most of the druids had kind of died out, they did still exist in some pockets, and the myth of Merlin kind of alludes to the last of these druids. But he also gives rise to the idea of the modern day wizard, so there you go. So Uther, he comes up with a plan with Merlin. He has Merlin use his magic to transform him into the likeness of Gorlias, and thus gain access to Iggerna at Tittengale. Now in witchcraft that's called a glamour, so create me a glamour so I look like this, and people will think I'm either somebody else or attractive or whatever. They're gonna see what I want them to see. And in the modern day we would call that, let's just be blunt, assault. So Iggerna, believing that this man is her husband, does her wifely duty and beds him, and it's during this when Arthur is conceived. The next day Gorlias is killed, and Iggerna is forced to marry Uther, where in subsequent years they would have a daughter. This daughter's name is Morgause. She marries King Lot and becomes the mother of Gawain and Mordred, who will come up later. Now at the end of Uther's reign, he falls ill and the wars begin to go badly against the Saxons, but he insists on leading his army himself, propped up on a horse. Now he defeats Heingeist, the Saxon's son, at St. Albans, and despite the Saxons calling him the half-dead king, he goes on to achieve victory. However, he later dies when he drinks from a well that had been poisoned by the Saxons, thus ending his life. Now as you can see, as early as even the story of Arthur's father, we're already blending legend with myth with real history. We're already seeing these strong connections to this post-Roman, sub-Roman world with these historical figures like Ambrosianus Aurelianus and Constantine III. And we see some links in these stories to some real kings who had lived during this time. It's entirely possible that Uther himself is at least partially based on a king named Tudrig, who was a historical queen of Glywasing, Welsh. And I thought those Russian names in all those episodes dealing with the Soviets was hard. But a lot of people think that Uther's story is based on King Tudrig simply because of the similarities in their death story. story and the fact that they both fought the Saxons. It's also thought that the Constantine that's referred to in the legends may or may not be Constantine III. Some people believe that it is Constantine of Daemonia, and a lot of people think that he is the son of the sub-Roman king rather than the King Constantine who went on to proclaim himself as Emperor of Gaul and whatever. And that's what seems to happen with historic figures and legendary figures, especially when you have multiple people telling these same stories and attributing these stories to their own cultures. These stories get morphed and changed, and it becomes impossible to pick apart, so you have to take the legend with the history and hope that the truth is somewhere in between. So now we're on to Arthur the Boy, the son of Uther, the future king of Avalon and the searcher for the Holy Grail. So let's get into it. So from Arthur's very conception, we can see that he's a bastard, and this would actually play a prominent role throughout his young life. Now, generally, it's believed that since he was illegitimate and since Igernia wanted nothing to do with this bastard son, that Merlin actually takes him in and adopts him. And it's believed that he does this because he feels guilt for his role in the conception. Obviously, anybody would. So essentially, he hides Arthur's origins, he takes on that father role, and he would essentially raise and guide Arthur throughout his youth. Now, Merlin had a student that he was enamored with, this woman called the Lady of the Lake. Now, in some tales, she's a fairy, in some tales, she's a sorceress, and in some tales, she's just some witch who's living in a cottage by a lake. But it's through her where we first see Lancelot. So Lancelot, his parents were killed, and he was actually left on her doorstep, and Vivian takes him in and raises him as her own child. Now, the thing we gotta know about lakes and waterways in early English history is historically it's always been a place of almost sacrifice, or I guess a better term would be ceremonial offerings, because it's in lakes and waterways where ancient warriors and kings would offer up swords and weapons and shields to the various deities and gods that they believed in return for some kind of divine protection. That's why if you wander into like any English lake bed, you can find a sword. And that practice actually dates back to like the earliest inhabitants of England. So it's believed that this lake was one of these lakes where people would come and make these offerings to their gods and deities for protection or whatever. And the Lady of the Lake, being this fairy or sorceress or whatever, she would be the recipient of these offerings. So the Lady of the Lake, Vivian, she is living in this little cottage on the side of the lake, and she sees these offerings and she blesses these people with her powers because, you know, she's the local witch or sorceress of the area. However, she is nowhere near as powerful as Merlin, and when Merlin comes onto the scene, he falls in love with her, and she says that she will give him her heart if he were to teach her everything he knows. So Merlin takes her on as his student, and the four of them kind of have this little surrogate family kind of thing going on. Arthur and Lancelot, they pretty much know and grow up with each other from an early age, and they occasionally spar with each other in this version of the legend. In other versions of the legend, the Lady of the Lake simply just raises Lancelot alone and then sends him to Arthur's court. But in this version, I like this version better, so it's the one I'm telling. So here we are. Arthur is growing up in his father's kingdom. He doesn't know that he's royalty. He thinks he's just an orphan, just like his best friend Lancelot. They spar together. They hope one day to be knight. And Merlin is essentially teaching Lancelot's adopted mother how to be a powerful sorceress by instilling all her knowledge into her. However, at this time, Merlin is still the official advisor to the king, and it's kind of through this where Arthur first meets Morgause, or Morgause, or let's just call her Morgan. And she's this beautiful princess. She's the daughter of Uther Pendragon and Igernia. And when the two meet, they fall passionately in love with each other, unbeknownst to each of them that they're each other's half-sibling. Now, in this version of the story, Merlin, he knows the secret and he tries everything to keep them apart without spilling the beans of Arthur's legitimacy. However, the more he tries to keep them apart, the more they want to be together because you know how teenagers are. This would result in Arthur's own illegitimate son, Mordred, who would come up at the end of his story. So when Arthur is 15, Uther of Pendragon dies, and it is at this time when Merlin reveals his origin story that he is the prince and he will be the future king of what will become England, or at this time, whatever little kingdom we're in, I guess guess it's Camelot. The stories are all contradictory and so vague sometimes with place names. And it's at around the same time when the Lady of the Lake presents Arthur with the famous sword Excalibur, that being the predominant myth that it was presented to him by the Lady of the Lake. Now, the telling of King Arthur pulling Excalibur from the anvil or the stone is actually a direct retelling of the Old Norse legend of Sigmund. It parallels it like line for line, and that kind of alludes to the tradition of what was going on the islands at the time. Remember, this was during the Saxon invasions, and the Saxons and the Angles and the Jutes were all kind of settling in England, and they were handing down their tales. And these tales are basically Germanic Proto-Norse tales, so they're gonna get handed down and shifted into the current culture. So by the time it's written in the 1100s, it's an English legend. So that legend is essentially that Merlin foretells that the heir of the throne of Pendragon would be the one who could pull this sword from this stone or this anvil. So all these people come out of the woodwork and none of them can pull this sword from this stone or this anvil. And then Arthur, kind of not knowing about the contest, he just kind of picks it up like it's nothing. However, no one's around to see it. So Merlin essentially tells young Arthur, put that sword back in there and pull it out in front of the people so they know that you were the true and rightful heir to the throne of Pendragon. To which he does in front of a public audience, and they declare him to be the rightful king of England or Camelot or whatever you want to call it. So here we are. Arthur is now declared to be the rightful son of Uther Pendragon, and he's the king of Camelot. However, there is a growing threat. There are more Saxon incursions and Angle incursions into England, and he has to quell these. And at this point, we jump back into actual history, the Battle of Badon, where King Arthur is first mentioned in any kind of written history by any kind of historian, and this battle gets entwined with the Arthurian legend. Now, we don't know exactly when this battle took place. We know it did take place sometime in the early 500s, and it was credited as a major victory for native Britons and post-Romanic Britons who would stop the westward encroachment of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms for a period. And it was widely believed that it is Ambrosius Aurelianus who organized this British resistance and won this battle, and that's where we get the King Arthur legend. Now, it's said that this was the 12th battle that Arthur had participated in, and that he alone had killed 960 men during this battle. And after this, Camelot would experience 12 years of peace. And during this 12 years of peace, Arthur would go on to marry his wife Guinevere and create the Knights of the Round Table. And it's from the tales of the Knights of the Round Table and those subsequent tellings where we get that modern story of Arthur with the chivalry and the romance and all this other stuff. However, it does not last forever. It eventually does fall. Partly because, remember Morgana or Morgan or whatever her name is, Arthur's half-sister? Well, that affair never ends, and even though her son Mordred is the prince of a neighboring kingdom and she is the wife of a neighboring king, he still lusts after her, and this affair just goes on and on behind Guinevere's back, which eventually leads to Guinevere's own affair with Lancelot while Arthur's away on one of these many quests, most likely the quest for the Holy Grail, because that's the one that always seems to come up. This eventually leads to chaos in the kingdom and the downfall of Arthur, and this is where Arthur's illegitimate son Mordred, he really steps into the picture. He essentially reveals Lancelot and Guinevere's adultery to King Arthur, and King Arthur actually sentences Guinevere to burn for her crimes. And this basically sparks off a civil war between Arthur and Lancelot. So Lancelot, he kills a bunch of the members of the Round Table and he flees to France, and then Arthur chases him into France to pursue him. And while he's in France, his son Mordred, he's put in charge, and he essentially just usurps the throne. And now Arthur, he has to return to England to regain his throne, although there are supporters for Mordred now, so they fight in these long series of bloody battles. And during the final battle, he faces Mordred in one-to-one combat, and he drives a spear through Mordred's chest, and Mordred, he just creeps along the edge of that spear and pulling it through him while he gets a blow on Arthur's head, and essentially Arthur is mortally wounded. It is then when the Lady of the Lake reappears after, learning everything from Merlin and sealing him in that tree or whatever. She takes Arthur's body to the mythical Isle of Avalon where he can rest, and he is still at rest to this day, only to rise again when the Kingdom of England is forced to deal with a threat that only he can resolve. Now, I know I just glossed over a lot of that whole story, but if I were to dive into every single rabbit hole and story associated with Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, I would be here for days. It's a very dense subject filled with contradictions and all kinds of crazy stuff. And frankly, I am way too lazy to go through all of that research and pick it apart and analyze every detail. I mean, the Adventures of the Knights of the Round Table alone, those contain enough source material that you can make an entire podcast about it. But those are essentially the highlights of the legend as most people understand it. Now, historically speaking, did Arthur exist? Probably not. The closest amalgam we have to him, or real historical figure we have to him, is Ambrosius Aurelius, that Romano Britan who did have some defeats against the Saxons in the late 490s, early 500s. I personally think that he is the catalyst or the spark point for all those legends of Arthur, which would come later. And the problem is, this is just a really dense subject because we're weaving together so many things. We're weaving together so many histories and myths and legends that come from all of these cultures which were interacting in England at the time. Because the problem is, and this is where the history really breaks down, the 5th and 6th centuries AD is where we're seeing a massive influx of a new population and a massive outflux of an old population in the British Isles, as well as all the people who stayed who saw these massive migrations of people coming in and going out. And what makes it even harder is all of this migration and intermingling of cultures. You're going to get intermingling of legends, and local legends are going to spring from that. And then compound that with conflicts that were going on at the time, and at the time Britannia was just considered a backwater again. Not a lot of people were paying attention to it. We see this huge gap in the historical narrative, because think about it, we have kingdoms which spring up right after the Roman depart, and then we have other settlers who are coming in and establishing their own kingdoms on top of these kingdoms, and these people have their own traditions and their own legends and their own gods and their own stories that they pass down, and they're all intermingling. And then you have conflict break out because of land or whatever. Creates for a very chaotic time, and somebody studying this very chaotic time, they want to make sense of it, so they think, well, maybe there was some kind of hero which was able to quell all this chaos to make it easier for me to learn about. And unfortunately for this period of time, there wasn't. King Arthur didn't actually exist. He was simply a folk hero who grew out of these old Welsh and old Germanic tales which came over from, the invaders, the Saxons, the Angles, the Jutes, as well as folk tales which were still kicking about from the native Britons who had lived there pre-Roman contact. Those tales and ideas didn't go away. We see them still preserved in the tales of Merlin and the Lady of the Lake, and hell, the tale of Excalibur, where the Lady of the Lake presents Excalibur to Arthur, that alludes to that old Bronze Age practice of offering a sword up into a waterway. And all those tales of Arthur and Guinevere and Lancelot and the knights and chivalry and the Round Table and stuff, that all comes later. That comes post-Norman conquest. And then the French get a hold of these tales and they add their own spins on it, so this influence is coming from all over Europe. So it's an amalgam of pretty much every folk tale you can think of, from Germany, Scandinavia, Wales, probably some from Ireland, the British Isles, Rome, Gaul, which would later become France. And then you throw pagan roots with Christian modernization onto it, and you get this crazy tale. But I'm not entirely done here, because I do want to discuss one thing. I kind of want to revisit something, and that is King Arthur's quest for the Holy Grail. Now, as we see in the quest for the Grail, many knights did search for the Grail. However, only Gawain was the one who was considered pure enough to actually obtain the Grail. However, since he decided not to repent for his mortal sin since he was not allowed to have the Grail. But we know that's not the true story of the Holy Grail. If you recall from my deep dive into the history of the Holy Grail from my season 2 episode, which you should totally go listen to, you would know that my hypothesis on it is it was some kind of clay or ceramic bowl or dish or cup that had probably been broken, discarded in a trash pile. It's probably turned to dust somewhere outside of Jerusalem in an old trash pit. But the Holy Grail does turn up in Arthurian legend, and why is that? Part of that is because a lot of people believe that the Holy Grail eventually ends up in France or England, but there's this scholarly hypothesis that speculates that the origin of the Holy Grail suggests that it may contain elements of the trope of magical cauldrons from Celtic mythology, and this is why it shows up in the Arthurian legend. Because let's remember the origins of the Grail. It's supposed to heal wounds and restore mortality or vitality or allow you to live forever or whatever. I mean, to be honest, why do you think Harrison Ford is like 80 and still living today and is still doing all his badass stuff? It's because he chose wisely. However, a lot of people do believe that this is the case because as the British Isles Christianized, the cauldron eventually turned into the Holy Grail to associate it with Jesus Christ. And you can see the Christianization of England being associated with the evolution of these tales. For example, Camelot is simply Eden because what is Camelot other than a silly place? Camelot is this perfect kingdom which perfectly embodies the ideas of chivalry and knighthood and monarchy as it was understood in the 14 and 1500s. However, just like Eden, we would be cast out of Camelot because of a downfall of basically human desires, basically the human desire in this case being the act of adultery, and the tale of the Grail would follow, and it would become even more popular because at this time, well, this is a little bit after the time, but this was around the time of the Crusades. And an often side note of the Crusades that everybody tends to forget is a big part of that was going on these archaeological expeditions to bring back holy relics from the Holy Land. And it's believed that the Knights Templar actually participated in a lot of these excavations, and not only bringing back the Holy Grail, they brought back pieces of the True Cross and other religious artifacts. So these real world events which were going on would have inspired these writers of these legends, and they would have woven that into these legends. So let's remember, this stuff was being written about from the 1100s to about the 1400s, so that idea isn't out of the realm of possibility. So is it possible that a Knights Templar or some knight in the Middle East or somebody doing some kind of excavation in the Middle East could have found the Holy Grail and brought it back to France or England? It's not outside of the realm of possibility. Personally, I don't think it's possible. Personally, I think it broke and is still sitting in a trash pit somewhere in Jerusalem to this day. But to a contemporary at the time, it probably was in France or in England, and somebody was probably hiding it in their castle or down a well or something, and it was worth going out and searching for. It's the cup of immortality, the cup of Christ, for Christ's sake. And in that medieval French or medieval English mindset, of course it would be bedazzled with gold and jewels and be this cup that only the King of Kings could drink from, and it wouldn't be anything like the little ceramic or wooden bowls that they were drinking out of at the time, which is why the Arthurian idea of the Holy Grail is this gold encrusted chalice. But hey, that's just medieval marketing for you. If I had a gold chalice and I stuck it in my monastery and said that's the Holy Grail, you wouldn't know if I was lying or not, because I'm a priest. And my job is to not only save your soul, but to also enrich my monastery and enrich my king or lord or whatever. But aside from that, we do see candidates for the Holy Grail that are emblazoned in this gold and pewter and all this silver and stuff. One is the Chalice of Donna Urica, and that's in Leon, Spain. Another is the Antioch Chalice. It is basically a silver gilt object, and it's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And the other is the Nantios Cup, which is actually a medieval wood mazer bowl, but it's said to have been made from the True Cross, and it resides near Wales. However, that's medieval, and it's not actually the Holy Grail. I don't even know why it's attributed to the hypothesis, but I digress. If you actually want to hear the real story of Arthur and his quest for the Holy Grail, I'm going to give you a quick synopsis of it right now. So it starts in this little village in England, and there's this guy, and he's going through the village with this cart, and he's going, "Bring out your dead, bring out your dead." And then in the distance you hear the sound of coconuts, and Arthur trots by, and they know that this is the king because he's not covered in shit like everybody else. And they decide that they are on a noble quest, a quest to find the Grail, because they decide not to go to Camelot because Camelot is such a silly place. And on this quest, they meet a brevity of different characters. One character actually teaches Arthur and his knights the difference between the airspeed velocity of an African and European unlegged swallow, which is a little tidbit that comes in handy much later in his quest. He then meets the Black Knight, who he has an inglorious battle against, and while completely dismembering him, the Black Knight refuses to admit defeat, even threatening to bite his ankles. Further along the ways, they discuss the idea of how to determine a witch from a regular woman. There's a lot of math involving ducks and wood, and one man actually gets turned into a newt, however he does get better. And in another part in the movie, they come across an autonomous collective, and with Arthur, they discuss the importance of the legality of kingship and the consent of the masses and other government issues. They also go on to have a brief discussion of the importance of the inherent violence in the feudal system. After some other adventures, they eventually make it to their destination, a cave which is guarded by the most fearsome and foul rabbit you would ever seen. And if you were just looking at the bones surrounding the area, you would have noticed that this was no rabbit to mess with. However, they decide to attack it, and they decide that a full-on frontal assault is useless, so they administer the Holy Hand Grenade. So while arming the Holy Hand Grenade and counting precisely to 3, they lob it at Death Bunny and it explodes, and that's basically where the film ends. They never actually achieve the Holy Grail, and to be honest, the Holy Grail is not actually found or achieved until the 1930s when Indiana Jones himself finds it in Petra, and he actually lets it fall down this chasm while trying to save the life of his father, Sean Connery, and his slam piece, Elsa, or whatever her name was. After that, we don't know what happens to it. It disappears from history. But with the Holy Grail aside, getting back to the Arthur legend, what can we really say about it? It's basically an amalgam of a whole bunch of different histories and sagas and tales and folklore, all mashed together in an attempt to make sense of a very chaotic age where not a lot of information from it survived. And if you really look at it, the Arthurian legend is really a trip through British and French history. You start in the early Bronze Age with these old legends, and you go through the Celtic period and the Romano period, all the way up to the late medieval period, and it gives us little glimpses and windows into the worldview of the peoples at the time. And when you deep dive into that, you start deep diving into the folklore of the peoples who lived there and came to live there over the centuries, because all these cultures that moved in and moved out added their own little piece to the Arthurian legend. Now, did Arthur actually exist? No. Did the Knights of the Round Table actually exist? No. Did the King of Camelot exist? No. But did the people and places and battles that inspired the legend exist? Most definitely, in some form. Because it's like I always say, every legend, every myth, every urban legend, every story has a flashpoint. It can start as simply as a warrior on a battlefield being integral in the winning of some battle or minor skirmish. It can start out as a mundane task that had some kind of religious significance attached to it. It can be a simple mundane object which eventually becomes sacred, or it can be a tale of a local man who went on to become a local king, or a scary tale that you tell your kids to keep them away from certain bodies of water or groups of strangers or whatever. But uncovering that initial spark, uncovering that initial flashpoint, that's what makes what I do so fascinating. Trying to find out exactly where the story began and how it had evolved over time is always endlessly fascinating, especially when you consider that these are the same stories that have been handed down to us generation after generation since the dawn of humanity. And no matter what kind of cultural spin we have on it, they're always interconnected somehow, and I think the Arthurian legend is one of the greatest examples of that. And yes, I did gloss over a ton. There is a ton of source material out there if you're interested in the Arthurian legends and where they stem from. I didn't even really get into the stories of the Knights of the Round Table or all the quests that they went on or all that stuff about how Camelot was this awesome Eden-like place to be. But maybe in future episodes I will touch on some of that that stuff. Maybe we'll revisit this subject. And on that note, that's all I really have for this episode. I do truly thank you all for listening. This was the 50th episode, a milestone episode when it comes to podcasting. And as I was looking, it's another milestone for me too. It has been almost 1 year since I launched my first episode on Spotify, which is my primary, I guess, host site for this show. Now, to be honest, I started recording the first season back in April of 2022. However, I didn't really launch the first episode until November of that year. And this episode will launch very close to that original launch date of that first episode. So I'm kind of excited about that because it shows where I've come in this first year of doing this show. And like I said, I am not going to stop. At this point, it is an addiction. I crave sitting in front of this microphone and telling these stories, mostly telling these stories from my personal perspective, because I feel like my personal perspective just isn't out there on any other media that I consume, and I feel like that's what makes my little show unique. But as always, if you did enjoy this, all I ask is that you tell a friend, share it with a friend. Word of mouth is truly how this podcast grows. It does not show very high in a lot of lists and algorithms, and to be honest, unless you're searching for it directly, you're probably not going to find it. It usually gets buried just because it's a niche genre and it's still a small kind of indie show. So you guys sharing it with people that you know is really the best way for it to grow. And I especially appreciate the ones who go to that little support this podcast thing on Spotify, click that link and donate whatever money you feel like donating. And you guys who do that, you really have no idea how much that helps me out. That makes me a little less anxious about money when it comes to my day job and my bills and all that stuff, and it frees up more time for me to do this on a regular basis. But on that note, once again, this is Mike. I do thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next one.